From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Jose Daniel Lopez. The United Nations Security Council has held an emergency meeting on the situation in Venezuela. Russia, China, and South Africa have thrown their weight behind the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, strongly condemning the attempted power grab by the opposition leader. The United States had called for the emergency UN meeting on Venezuela after the U.S. recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as the interim president. Of the 15-member Security Council, 4 voted against the emergency session, 9 agreed to hold the meeting, while 2 member states abstained. The United States Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, referred to President Maduro as a former president and tried to rally countries to support the U.S. agenda in Venezuela.
The United States stands proudly with you as we stand together in support of Venezuela. You knew the Venezuelan people did not have a moment to spare. And now it's time for every other nation to pick a side. No more delays, no more games. Either you stand with the forces of freedom, or you're in league with Maduro and his mayhem.
Venezuela's Foreign Minister Jorge Arriaza is at the emergency meeting to defend the constitutional government of Venezuela. He says it is the United States that is instigating a coup, and he provided evidence to the Council.
In this case, the United States is not behind the coup d'etat. It is in advance. It's in the vanguard of the coup d'etat. It is dictating the orders, not only to the Venezuelan opposition, but also to the satellite governments in the region, and it seems in Europe and the other parts of the world. As proof, we have tweets here from social media. We have appeals, calls to the security forces, to the Bolivarian National Army to take position against the legitimate authorities, against the constitutional government of President Maduro, by Secretary of State Pompeo and by Vice President Pence. It was on the 22nd where Vice President Pence, basically in a tweet, gave a green light for a coup d'etat in Venezuela.
Arriaza also reminded the UN Council that it has no authority to impose deadlines on Caracas. He also told France and Spain to focus on their own domestic affairs.
From where do you get that you have any legal authority whatsoever to give deadlines or ultimatums to a sovereign people? From where do you get this? Why doesn't the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez hold elections, like President Nicolas Maduro told him yesterday? Who elected Pedro Sánchez? Hold elections in the United Kingdom. I dare you. Why is President Macron, instead of focusing on the continuous yellow jacket protests by French workers, focuses on attacking Venezuela? Now, when they see a worker wearing a yellow jacket near the Champs-Élysées working, the guards flee, afraid, because they are scared of their own people. Focus on your own problems.
Russia and China were at the forefront of the calls against foreign meddling in Venezuela.
The Russian Federation cannot support the attempts by our American colleagues to conduct a discussion of the situation in Venezuela. And in fact, introducing in our agenda issues formulated in this way, this is a gross abuse of the prerogatives of the members of the Security Council, especially, in particular, the permanent members. The internal situation in this Latin American country is not an item on the agenda of our council. We don't see any external threats coming from what is taking place in Venezuela. Venezuela does not represent a threat to peace and security. If anything does represent a threat to peace, it is the shameless and aggressive actions of the United States and their allies aimed at the ouster of the legitimately elected president of Venezuela.
China supports the efforts made by the Venezuelan government to uphold national sovereignty, independence, and stability. China maintains that all countries should abide by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, especially the norms governing international relations and the principles of international law, such as non-interference in each other's internal affairs.
South Africa says it is strongly opposed to leadership changes executed outside of electoral processes. The country's ambassador to the United Nations chastised the UN Security Council for what he says it is its failure to support electoral guarantees.
South Africa is firmly against any attempt of undue or unconstitutional change of government of Venezuela. The Security Council should never be an instrument that validates an unconstitutional changes of any government anywhere, anytime. Instead, the Council should promote avenues that create an environment for conclusive, inclusive dialogue, and that cooperation that will ease the challenges and hardships faced by Venezuelan people.
From the Latin American countries, the governments of Nicaragua and Cuba also showed their support to the government of President Nicolas Maduro.
People of Nicaragua consider that Venezuela does in no way represent a threat to international peace and security. For this reason, we strongly urge and demand that the sovereign decisions of the Venezuelan people be respected.
The current administration of the United States of America seems to have dusted off the Monroe Doctrine and to be wielding it as its preferred arm of diplomacy. And in a fresh extension of its imperialist policy in the region, is threatening with particular ferocity and malice Venezuela, and has gone so far as to declare that all options are on the table.
Barbados UN representative reiterated the Caribbean community's position on Venezuela at the special session.
Heads of government called on external forces to refrain from doing anything to destabilize the situation and underscored the need to step back from the brink and called on all actors, internal and external, to avoid actions which could escalate an already explosive situation to the detriment of the people of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and which would have far-reaching negative consequences for the wider region.
As the world leaders attended the Security Council meeting, a protest was held in Toronto against U.S.-Canada support coup in Venezuela. This follows announcements by the Trump and Trudeau administrations recognizing the self-appointed opposition leader as president of Venezuela. The rally is taking place outside the office of the foreign minister. Demonstrators are demanding that Venezuela's democracy and sovereignty be respected.
Socialist Action Canada, we have Nettie speaking later on behalf of them.
Canada's largest union has rejected the Canadian government's attempt to interfere with the democratic processes and sovereignty of Venezuela. The Canadian Union of Public Employees say that the people of Venezuela have the right to determine their economic and political future. There's also a demonstration outside of the White House in Washington, D.C. Anti-war and civil rights activists are rallying against the Trump administration's interference in Venezuela. Earlier on Friday, Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro said that the channels of communication with the opposition remain wide open, but he wants dialogue to take place without conditions. Maduro also said the Bolivarian constitution is the main instrument to defeat the coup against his government. President Maduro made the remarks while talking to international media at the presidential palace in Caracas regarding the ongoing political crisis in the country. We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back. Venezuelan migrants in Ecuador can now leave the country after receiving clearance from the government. Nearly 300 Venezuelans are heading to their country as part of the Return to the Homeland plan. Earlier on Saturday, the Ecuadorian government had delayed the 3 scheduled flights to Caracas by not granting permissions. We were able to speak with some of the migrants as they waited for confirmation on their return.
A criminal is a criminal regardless of his nationality. Just because one person who may have committed a crime is Venezuelan, they don't have to attack all Venezuelans. People didn't come here to do bad, they came here to look for a better future. And as far as what the Ecuadorian government said about demanding that Ecuadorians show their criminal records to enter the country, I think that all migrants should be asked for that credential, not just Venezuelans.
4 weeks ago, I was attacked by a group of xenophobic people. I confronted by them and we got in a fight. One of my feet got broken. When I was on the floor, I saw several policemen and I called them. They came and told me, "Shut up, you Venezuelan."
Our correspondent in Quito, Denise Herrera, is following the story.
Finally, the 3 flights under the Return to Homeland plan have left Ecuador after the official announcement of the Ecuadorian authorities that allowed the flights left Ecuador today. So we should remember that in the morning, the Venezuelan authorities were really worried about this situation and these decisions taken by the government of Ecuador, and they have said that this is a violation of human rights, that the government of Ecuador separate 270 Venezuelans from their families in their homelands. Finally, the decision of the Ecuador permits that the flights came to Ecuador, and also 270 Venezuelan people will come back to their homeland. We should remember that these actions taken by the Venezuelan government came after a series of xenophobic attacks against the Venezuelan citizens after the death of a woman in Ibarra on the north of Ecuador. So finally, these people can return to their homeland.
We thank Denise for that report. The Bolivian Supreme Court has announced that all material for the primary elections is ready for Sunday. Bolivians will vote to choose the candidates of each political party who will run in the general elections this October. This is the first time Bolivia is holding primary elections. Several organizations, including the Organization of American States, have sent observation missions to supervise the voting. Our correspondent in Bolivia, Freddy Morales, gives us more details.
The Supreme Court in Bolivia has announced that everything is ready for the primary elections set for Sunday, 27th of January. More than 7,000 polling stations will receive almost 2 million people who will vote to choose a candidate of the 9 political parties taking part in the election. Only people who are members of these political parties can take part. There will be observers from around 15 organizations, including the Organization of the American States and the Latin American Union of Electoral Entities. The elected candidates will participate in the next general elections in October 2019.
We also thank Freddy for that report. At least 34 people are dead and hundreds are missing after a dam operated by a mining firm collapsed in Brazil on Friday. It caused severe flooding in the southern state of Minas Gerais. The mine and several houses were buried under a sea of mud. The dam is owned by Brazilian company Vale. The cause of the accident is not yet known.
The recovery of the area will be difficult because the whole area was full of vegetation, with a river and vegetation. The vegetation is all gone now.
Also in Brazil, authorities are going to investigate members of the Bolsonaro family for suspicious payments. Accounts to be investigated belong to the First Lady, Michelle Bolsonaro, and her son, Flavio Bolsonaro. An accounted amount of money was found in the accounts of both his wife and son. The president denies any wrongdoing and said that the money deposited into his wife's account was a payment of a loan. Pope Francis has said that Latin America is not the backyard of anyone. The Pope is on a 5-day visit to Panama for the World Youth Day event.
Your people are not the backyard of any society, of anyone. You have a rich history that must be treasured and encouraged. The seeds of the kingdom of God were planted here, on this soil. We must recognize it, take care of it, and keep it safe so nothing of what got planted here get dry, due to malicious interests that leads to corruption and exploitation of the poorest.
The Mexican government said it won't accept the return of migrants who have appealed the refusal of their asylum request to the United States. Mexico won't accept unaccompanied minors or people with health problems either. This comes after U.S. authorities seek to return 20 Central American migrants to Mexico at the border crossing point near Tijuana. Every year, Honduras loses 10% of its GDP due to corruption. According to some organizations, this is a problem of the whole state system.
According to the National Anti-Corruption Council, Honduras loses around $1 billion due to corruption. The majority of public institutions are involved, and the ones in charge of investigating have proven to be ineffective.
Unfortunately, we haven't been effective as a country to sanction illegal profit. This keeps corruption alive, and every public worker of any public institution can commit this crime and note that the chances of being identified by the judiciary are very limited.
There have been many reports on how almost 50% of the health sector's budget is lost because of corruption. This has caused deaths because the system lacks equipment and medicine in the medical centers.
49% of the budget is wasted by corruption. This is very serious and painful because we are talking about the health system. This costs people's lives. They die directly because of this. This was recently reported by the Association for a More Just Society.
In many cases, corruption is linked to high state officials that were hired due to political connections and not for professional merit. In these cases, they tried to avoid their responsibility.
The positions they get are not always linked to their merits, and this is probably one of the main reasons that cause institutions to not work as they should. They use the excuse of having too much work so that they are not held responsible.
The officials responsible for monitoring institutions from the government avoid responsibility by blaming the failure of the fight against corruption.
We don't have more than 300 million to process all the public administration of 298 municipalities.
One of the worst consequences of corruption is poverty that affects 68% of the population, and that in itself prompts massive migration. More than 400 Hondurans are leaving the country every day.
On Tuesday, parliamentarians in St. Lucia will debate a no-confidence motion in the leadership of Prime Minister Alan Chastanet. The motion calls for Chastanet's immediate resignation. The opposition leader has cited mounting abuse of public office, unreasonable decision-making, and unsustainable fiscal deficits. The motion can only succeed if 3 government MPs support it.
Under Section 39(1) of the Finance Administration.
Barbados will set up an anti-corruption and counter-terrorism agency to work with the police force.
Our government will establish an anti-corruption and counter-terrorism entity within the Ministry of National Security to supplement the work of the police. It is not going to be a huge agency, but it is critical that people come to work every day to fight corruption, because that is part and parcel of the cancer of what we are fighting in this country with respect to matters that I think the Commissioner, as far back as 3 years ago, pointed out to the difficulties that they have experienced with respect to the port and other areas with respect to guns coming in. We need to get on top of these issues institutionally first to be able to go forward.
We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back. Angola's parliament has decriminalized homosexuality after voting for renewal of its penal code. Parliamentarians voted on Wednesday to remove the vices against nature clause in its law. They also banned discrimination based on someone's sexuality. This is the first overhaul of the country's criminal code since its independence from Portugal in 1975.
The reality is that the one who has to protect us must not be the one who takes away our rights. So I think all this is going in the right direction. We are re-educated in society. As an individual, we may have ideals, but for public servants, it's more difficult.
While the LGBTQ community is protected by South Africa's constitution, the reality for many members of the community is quite different. Many LGBT South Africans still have a hard time finding employment and often face exclusion.
So my name is Ditseho. Yes, very lazy parents. My name is my surname. People always think I made a mistake, but it is my name is my surname. And I am a journalist by profession. I am a PhD candidate. And I'm also a transgender woman and activist. And my pronouns are she and her.
While decorated with university degrees, Ditseho says her identity as a transgender woman makes it almost impossible to land a good job.
A lot of transgender women end up as sex workers because we find it hard to find jobs, because employers don't know what to do with us. And we are a very qualified people. I know a lot of transgender graduates, but when you go for an interview, bosses almost see you as a minefield. They don't know how to deal with you. They don't know what to call you. They don't know how to step. They walk around eggshells around you. They literally see you as a lawsuit waiting to happen because they feel like, I know myself, I will say the wrong thing, I will misgender her or use the wrong pronoun, and she'll sue us, you know.
She says transgender people are forced to become activists in South Africa because of the ignorance that prevails. Many well-known people in the country have come out as either members or supporters of the LGBTI community. Some have even written about it, but society remains conservative.
People demand you to explain, you know, heterosexual people, I call it heterosexual privilege, straight privilege, where people feel that because I'm straight, I'm right, and because you're not straight, you're somehow wrong. And sometimes it's not even, so they feel like they deserve an explanation. And I found myself in situations like that, and I find that a bit unfair because, you know, when people want information about, I don't know, a soccer game or an album, or they want lyrics to a song, they don't hesitate to go on the net. But, you know, with things like this, they feel like, I'm not going to go on the net, you are going to explain it to me.
If you've just joined us, welcome to it. You're listening to The Gay Agenda with me.
Many African countries still use the colonial anti-gay laws to suppress expression or dialogue about sexuality and gender identity. South Africa, with its progressive constitution, still has a society that won't accept people like Ditseho. Now the question remains, what is their recourse? Matiba Mahlachi, Telesur, Pretoria.
Teenage Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg says oil and gas companies are committing crimes against humanity. The 16-year-old staged a protest Friday on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos.
I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as if you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is.
France's Yellow Vest protest took to the streets for the 11th weekend in a row. Here are the details on that and more stories from around the world.
Yellow Vest protests in Paris once again turned violent when police used water cannons and tear gas to disperse demonstrators. A journalist and a police officer were injured in the clash. The marches were sparked by the rise in fuel taxes, which the government has since scrapped. Asia's first gay pride boat parade set sail as boats took to the waters of Myanmar's Yangon River.
Yangon or Myanmar LGBT people, especially young people, are now more courageous and now out compared to 5-6 last year. So mostly the younger generation of the LGBT community are more out and proud.
Hundreds turned out for the funeral of a young Palestinian, Ehab, Atullah Abed, who was killed by Israeli forces on Friday during the Great March of Return protests. The movement, which started in March last year, saw a series of protests along the Israeli-Palestinian border to demand the right of Palestinians to return to their homes. About 170 Palestinians have reportedly been killed and another 15,000 injured since the protests began. And with this story, we come to the end of this news brief. This and many other stories you can find at our website at telsurenglish.net. And don't forget to join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Jose Daniel Lopez. Thank you for watching.